The morning of June 3rd, 1942 dawned with deceptive calm across the vast Pacific Ocean. But beneath its tranquil surface, the greatest naval confrontation in history was about to unfold. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood on the bridge of his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, his weathered hands gripping a decoded Japanese message that would change the course of World War II forever. The intelligence intercept, crackling with static from the Navy's cryptographic station, revealed Admiral Usadoku Yamamoto's audacious plan to draw the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll. 6 months had passed since the devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Empire had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tide. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to the Solomon Islands, the rising sun flag flew triumphant over conquered territories. The American public, still reeling from the humiliation of December 7th, desperately needed a victory to restore faith in their Pacific strategy. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, believed that one more crushing blow would force the Americans to negotiate a favorable peace. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. Feint toward the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces north, then strike Midway with overwhelming force. The tiny coral atoll, just over 1,000 miles northwest of Honolulu, served as America's westernmost outpost and early warning system. Its capture would open the door to Hawaii itself. The Japanese fleet departing from their bases was a sight that would have struck terror into any observer. 4 aircraft carriers formed the heart of Yamamoto's striking force, the mighty Akagi flagship of Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, the battle-tested Kaga, the swift Hairyu, and her sister ship Soryu. These floating fortresses carried over 250 of Japan's finest pilots, men who had honed their skills in the skies over China and perfected their craft during the Pearl Harbor raid. Supporting this aerial armada was a formidable surface fleet, including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, while submarines prowled the depths to intercept any American vessels attempting to interfere. The Japanese were so confident of victory that they had already prepared detailed plans for the occupation of Midway, complete with administrators and construction equipment to transform the atoll into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot, Morrison's comprehensive account and history of United States naval operations in World War II, the Japanese commitment to the Midway operation represented the largest naval force ever assembled under a single command in Pacific waters. But Nimitz possessed something Yamamoto did not: the ability to read his enemy's mail. The Navy's codebreakers at Station HYPO, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had cracked portions of the Japanese naval code J-UN-25. Through painstaking analysis of intercepted radio traffic, they had pieced together enough of Yamamoto's plan to give the Americans their first real advantage since the war began. The American response was swift and desperate. Every available ship was rushed toward Midway, including the carriers Enterprise and Hornet under Admiral William Frederick Halsey, and the hastily repaired Yorktown under Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. These 3 flat tops represented virtually the entire remaining American carrier strength in the Pacific, a force that appeared pitifully inadequate against the Japanese juggernaut bearing down on them. As the opposing fleets converged on the tiny speck of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific, neither side fully grasped that they were about to participate in the battle that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. In the Japanese cramped basement of Pearl Harbor's 14th Naval District headquarters, Commander Joseph John Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of intercepted radio messages. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across his unshaven face as he worked around the clock to decode what would become the most crucial intelligence breakthrough of the Pacific War. His team of cryptanalysts, linguists, and radio operators had been monitoring Japanese naval communications for months, gradually piecing together fragments of their operational codes. The breakthrough came when Rochefort's team identified the target designation, AF appearing repeatedly in Japanese message traffic. Through an ingenious deception, they instructed Midway to broadcast a false message about water problems on the island. When Japanese intelligence dutifully reported that AF was experiencing water difficulties, Rochefort knew with certainty that Midway was Yamamoto's target. Admiral Nimitz faced an agonizing decision. The intelligence seemed solid, but committing his remaining carriers based on code intercepts was an enormous gamble. If Rochefort was wrong, the Japanese could strike Hawaii or the West Coast, while the American fleet was hundreds of miles away chasing phantoms. The admiral called a conference of his top commanders, spreading the decoded messages across the table like pieces of a deadly puzzle. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles to the northwest, the Japanese First Air Fleet continued its methodical approach toward Midway. Admiral Nagumo, a cautious and experienced commander, maintained strict radio silence as his carriers plowed through the heavy Pacific swells. The Akagi, his flagship, led the formation with military precision. Her flight deck crowded with Nakajima Type 97 attack bombers and Mitsubishi Type 0 fighters. The pilots aboard the Japanese carriers were the elite of naval aviation. Many had flown combat missions over China, perfecting their skills in real warfare rather than training exercises. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, prepared his air crews for what they believed would be another devastating blow against American naval power. These men had never tasted defeat, and their confidence bordered on arrogance. On Midway itself, preparations for the expected assault reached fever pitch. Marine aviators worked frantically to ready their outdated aircraft for combat, knowing they would face the world's most experienced naval pilots flying superior equipment. The island's anti-aircraft guns were cleaned and repositioned, while ground crews loaded bombs and fuel into every available aircraft. Naval historian Gordon Prange noted in Miracle at Midway that the American preparations on the island represented a desperate attempt to create a defensive force capable of withstanding the most powerful naval airstrike ever assembled. The American carriers, meanwhile, raced northward under radio silence. Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown assumed overall command, while Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance led Enterprise and Hornet after Admiral Halsey was hospitalized with a severe skin condition. Spruance, primarily a cruiser commander, would prove to be one of the most capable tactical leaders in American naval history, though few suspected it at the time. Below decks on the American carriers, pilots studied intelligence briefings and aircraft recognition charts. Unlike their Japanese counterparts, many of these aviators had never seen combat. They knew they were outgunned and outnumbered, but they also understood that the fate of the Pacific War might rest in their hands. The weather on June 3rd remained overcast and squally, providing some concealment for both fleets as they maneuvered toward their fateful rendezvous. Patrol planes from both sides searched the empty ocean, their crews straining to catch the first glimpse of enemy ships that would trigger the greatest carrier battle in naval history. As darkness fell on June 3rd, the opposing forces were separated by less than 300 miles of open ocean. Neither commander knew the exact position of his enemy, but both understood that dawn would bring a battle that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific forever. At 0 for 30 hours on June 4th, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness over the Central Pacific was shattered by the roar of aircraft engines. From the flight deck of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway Atoll. Consisting of 108 bombers and fighters under the command of Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the Japanese pilots climbed into the gray morning sky with supreme confidence, expecting to encounter minimal resistance from the tiny American garrison. Simultaneously, search planes from both fleets fanned out across the ocean, their crews scanning the horizon for the telltale smoke trails that would reveal enemy ships. The weather remained partially overcast, with scattered rain squalls that could hide entire fleets from aerial observation. In this deadly game of blind man's bluff, the first side to locate their opponent would gain an enormous tactical advantage. On Midway, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese strike at 0520 hours, giving the defenders precious minutes to scramble their fighters and evacuate non-essential personnel. The island's obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters and a few Grumman Wildcat interceptors rose to meet the attackers, their pilots knowing they faced overwhelming odds. Major Floyd Blue Parks led 25 Marine fighters against more than twice their number of experienced Japanese aviators flying superior aircraft. The aerial battle over Midway was brief and savage. The Japanese Zeros, with their exceptional maneuverability and experienced pilots, decimated the American fighter force. Within minutes, 15 of the 25 Marine fighters were shot down, with Major Parks among the dead. The surviving American pilots fought valiantly, but could not prevent the Japanese bombers from reaching their target. Lieutenant Tomonaga's bombers swept over the atoll in precise formation, their payloads devastating the airfield and military installations. Hangars exploded in sheets of flame, fuel dumps sent black smoke billowing into the sky, and the runway was cratered by high explosive bombs. However, the Japanese strike leader noticed that American aircraft were still taking off during the attack, indicating that the airfield remained partially operational. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown waited anxiously for reconnaissance reports from his search planes. At 0534 hours, a Catalina flying boat from Midway radioed the electrifying message. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees,
Out the distance.
180 miles.
I'll give that.
The American fleet finally knew where to find their quarry. Fletcher immediately ordered Admiral Spruance to launch his strike groups from Enterprise and Hornet, while maintaining Yorktown in reserve. The decision reflected sound tactical doctrine, but it also meant that the Americans would attack with only 2/3 of their available aircraft. Spruance, despite his limited carrier experience, recognized the critical importance of timing and ordered an immediate launch of all available planes. According to Walter Lord's definitive account, Incredible Victory, the American decision to launch immediately rather than coordinate a mass strike reflected the desperate urgency of the moment and the recognition that delay could prove fatal. The American strike groups took off in a piecemeal fashion that would have horrified peacetime commanders. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters departed at different times and failed to rendezvous as planned. This apparent tactical blunder would later prove to be one of the most fortunate accidents in American military history, as the scattered attacks would arrive over the Japanese fleet at intervals that prevented effective defensive coordination. As the American aircraft disappeared into the morning haze, heading northwest toward the Japanese carriers, Admiral Nagumo faced his own critical decisions. Tominaga had radioed that a second strike against Midway was necessary to completely neutralize the airfield. But Nagumo was also aware that American ships might be operating in the area. The Japanese admiral ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway, a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in military history. For Japanese aircraft carriers, the cream of the Imperial Navy steamed confidently through the Pacific swells, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being prepared for a follow-up attack on Midway. They had no idea that American dive bombers were already winging their way through the morning sky, seeking vengeance for Pearl Harbor and the salvation of the American Pacific Fleet. At 0920 hours on June 4th, the first American aircraft to reach the Japanese fleet were not the high-flying dive bombers or the nimble fighters, but the slow, lumbering Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet. Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron, a part Cherokee pilot from South Dakota, led his 15 aircraft in a direct attack against the Japanese carrier force, knowing full well that he was leading his men into what amounted to a suicide mission. The Douglas Devastator was already obsolete when the war began, a fact tragically evident as Waldron's squadron approached the Japanese fleet. The aircraft were slow, poorly armored, and carried torpedoes that frequently malfunctioned. Worse still, the squadron had become separated from its fighter escort and would face the Japanese combat air patrol alone. Zero fighters swarmed around the American torpedo bombers like angry wasps, their machine guns and 20mm cannons tearing through the unarmored aircraft. One by one, the Devastators fell burning into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft was among the first to be shot down, the squadron commander still trying to coordinate the attack as his plane plummeted toward the ocean. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been destroyed, their crews dead or dying in the shark-infested waters below. Only Ensign George Gay survived, clinging to a life raft while Japanese destroyers steamed past, their crews unaware of the lone American witness to their apparent victory. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was repeated with horrifying regularity, as subsequent American torpedo attacks pressed home against the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown met similar fates. Their obsolete aircraft, no match for the experienced Zero pilots, and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese fleet. Of the 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked the Japanese carriers that morning, only 6 returned to their ships. Admiral Nagumo, observing the slaughter from the bridge of the Akagi, felt a surge of confidence. The American attacks had been pressed home with admirable courage, but had achieved nothing except the destruction of their own aircraft. Not a single torpedo had found its target, and the Japanese carriers continued to steam unharmed through the Pacific swells. The admiral ordered his flight deck crews to continue preparing the second strike against Midway. Confident that American naval aviation posed no serious threat to his veteran fleet, historian Samuel Morrison wrote in his official Navy history that the torpedo attacks accomplished nothing material, but they accomplished something that was worth all the sacrifice by drawing Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupting the enemy's defensive preparations. What Nagumo did not realize was that the seemingly futile torpedo attacks had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to wave-top height, leaving the sky above the carriers virtually undefended. High overhead, completely unnoticed by the Japanese lookouts, who were focused on the torpedo planes, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were beginning their attack runs. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading the dive bombers from Enterprise, had nearly turned back when his fuel gauges showed critically low levels. By sheer chance, he spotted the Japanese destroyer Arashi racing to rejoin the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine. Following the destroyer's wake, McCluskey led his squadron directly to the Japanese carriers, just as they were most vulnerable. The Japanese flight decks presented perfect targets. Aircraft were spotted for launch, fuel lines were pressurized, and ammunition was stacked in neat piles. The carriers had been maneuvering violently to avoid the torpedo attacks, preventing them from launching additional fighters or maintaining proper defensive formations. In their moment of apparent triumph over the American torpedo squadrons, the Japanese fleet was more vulnerable than it had been at any point since Pearl Harbor. As McCluskey pushed over into his dive, followed by 37 other dauntless dive bombers, the course of the Pacific War hung in the balance. The Japanese carriers below represented 6 months of virtually unopposed conquest across the Pacific. Their destruction would not only even the numerical odds, but would eliminate Japan's most experienced pilots and aircraft. Losses that the Japanese war economy could never fully replace. The American torpedo squadrons had paid a terrible price for this moment of opportunity, but their sacrifice was about to be vindicated in the most spectacular fashion. At 0:10:22 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his dauntless dive bomber into a 70-degree dive toward the Japanese carrier Kaga. Behind him, 37 other American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown began their attack runs in what would become the most decisive 5 minutes in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese carriers below, caught in the middle of rearming and refueling operations, were floating ammunition dumps waiting for a spark. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck the Kaga near her island superstructure, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among fully fueled aircraft. The explosion triggered a chain reaction of secondary fires as aviation gasoline and ordnance cooked off in a series of devastating blasts. Within seconds, the pride of the Japanese carrier fleet was transformed into a floating inferno. Her flight deck buckled and twisted by the force of internal explosions. Simultaneously, dive bombers from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie, struck the carrier Soryu with equal devastation. 3 direct hits turned the newest ship in the Japanese carrier fleet into a blazing wreck. Her captain, Ryusuke Yanagimoto, chose to go down with his ship, rather than abandon the men trapped below decks. Lashing himself to the bridge as the carrier settled by the bow, the Akagi Admiral Nagumo's flagship and the most prestigious carrier in the Japanese Navy, fell victim to a single well-placed bomb that penetrated her flight deck and exploded among the aircraft being prepared for the second Midway strike. The blast ignited fuel and ammunition that had been carelessly stacked on the hangar deck, creating an uncontrollable fire that spread throughout the ship. Nagumo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, was forced to transfer his flag to a cruiser as his magnificent flagship burned around him. In the span of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 aircraft carriers had been mortally wounded. The Hiryu, sailing slightly apart from the main formation, escaped immediate destruction, but would soon face her own reckoning. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, commanding the 2nd Carrier Division from Hiryu's bridge, watched in horror as his sister carriers were consumed by flames that could be seen for miles across the Pacific. The psychological impact on the Japanese fleet was devastating. These were the same carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and driven the Royal Navy from the Indian Ocean. Their pilots were considered invincible, the ships unsinkable monuments to Japanese naval supremacy. Now they were burning wrecks, their aircraft destroyed, and their irreplaceable aircrews dead or dying in the flames. War correspondent Robert Sherrod later wrote that the destruction of the Japanese carriers at Midway was not merely a tactical victory, but a spiritual defeat from which the Japanese Navy never fully recovered. On the burning carriers, scenes of heroism and tragedy played out as damage control parties fought desperately to save their ships. On the Kaga, Captain Jisaku Okada remained at his post directing firefighting efforts, even as the bridge became untenable. The Soryu's engineering officer stayed below to maintain power for the pumps, sacrificing his life to give his shipmates a chance at survival. These acts of courage could not overcome the fundamental reality that the carriers had suffered mortal wounds. The American dive bomber pilots, having delivered their deadly cargo, pulled out of their dives and headed home to their carriers. Many were running critically low on fuel, having spent precious minutes searching for the Japanese fleet. Some would not make it back, forced to ditch in the ocean when their fuel ran out. But they had accomplished something that would be remembered as long as naval battles are studied. They had broken the back of Japanese naval aviation in a single, devastating attack. Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise received the first reports of the strike with quiet satisfaction. The man who had never commanded carriers before this battle had just overseen the most successful carrier air attack in history, but he knew the battle was far from over. The Japanese still had one operational carrier, and their surface fleet remained formidable. Moreover, the American victory had come at a terrible cost in aircraft and pilots. As smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the Pacific sky, marking the funeral pyres of 3 Japanese carriers, both fleets prepared for the next phase of the battle. The Japanese, stunned but not defeated, would strike back with their remaining carrier. The Americans, having achieved more than they dared hope, would have to prove they could capitalize on their stunning success. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the Hiryu as columns of black smoke marked the graves of his sister carriers on the horizon. A graduate of the Naval Academy at Iwo Jima and one of Japan's most aggressive carrier commanders, Yamaguchi refused to accept that the battle was lost. With characteristic determination, he ordered immediate preparations for a counterattack against the American fleet, determined to salvage something from the disaster that had befallen the First Air Fleet. The Hiryu, though alone, remained a potent weapon. Her air group consisted of 18 Nakajima dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters, small but experienced force led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. These pilots had witnessed the destruction of their sister ships and flew with the fury of men seeking vengeance. At 10:50 hours, Yamaguchi launched his strike toward the last known position of the American carriers, gambling everything on one final blow. Meanwhile, Admiral Fletcher aboard the Yorktown faced his own crucial decisions. The American victory, though spectacular, had come at enormous cost. The dive bomber and torpedo squadrons were decimated, fuel was running low, and many aircraft would need extensive repairs before they could fly again. Intelligence reports indicated that at least one Japanese carrier remained operational, and Fletcher knew that Japanese counterattacks were inevitable. At 12:10 hours, radar operators aboard the Yorktown detected incoming aircraft bearing southwest at a distance of 46 miles. The ship's general alarm rang throughout the vessel as Captain Elliott, Buckmaster, ordered all available fighters airborne and prepared his crew for the first Japanese counterattack since Pearl Harbor. The Yorktown's combat air patrol, though outnumbered, climbed to intercept the Japanese strike group with grim determination. The aerial battle above the American fleet was fierce and confused. Zero fighters, despite their numerical disadvantage, proved their superiority in individual combat by shooting down several American interceptors. However, the Wildcats managed to break up the Japanese formation and shoot down several attackers before they could reach the carriers. Lieutenant Kobayashi, leading the dive bombers, pressed through the defensive fire with the same precision that had characterized Japanese attacks throughout the war. 3 bombs struck the Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among the stored aircraft. The second bomb destroyed the ship's radar and communications equipment, leaving her partially blind and deaf. The third and most damaging hit ruptured the uptakes to the boilers, reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots and filling her engineering spaces with thick black smoke. According to naval historian Clark Reynolds and the fast carriers, the damage to Yorktown represented the first successful Japanese air attack against an American carrier since the war began, demonstrating that Japanese naval aviation, though weakened, remained capable of striking back. For 2 hours, damage control parties aboard the Yorktown worked miracles of seamanship and engineering. Chief Petty Officer John Vassell led a party into the smoke-filled engineering spaces to repair the damaged uptakes. Working by feel in complete darkness, while breathing apparatus leaked and temperatures soared above human endurance. Their heroic efforts restored the carrier's speed to 19 knots and enabled her to resume flight operations. Admiral Yamaguchi, receiving reports that one American carrier had been damaged, prepared a second strike to finish off the wounded ship. However, his remaining aircraft were few, and many of his most experienced pilots had been lost in the first attack. At 0130 hours, he launched his final 10 aircraft in a desperate attempt to even the odds before the Americans could reorganize their forces. The second Japanese attack found the Yorktown apparently recovered from her earlier damage, her flight deck active with landing aircraft and her escort destroyers steaming in perfect formation. Once again, American fighters rose to meet the attackers, but several Japanese aircraft managed to penetrate the defensive screen. 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, causing massive flooding and a severe list that threatened to capsize the ship. Captain Buckmaster, recognizing that his ship was in mortal danger, reluctantly ordered abandoned ship. The Yorktown's crew, many of whom had served together for years, lined up in perfect military formation on the slanting deck before sliding down ropes to the waiting destroyers. Their discipline and courage in the face of disaster exemplified the spirit that was beginning to turn the tide in the Pacific War. The Hiryu had struck back with characteristic Japanese ferocity, but Yamaguchi knew that his lonely carrier could not long survive against 3 American flat tops. As evening approached on June 4th, he prepared for the final act of the Midway drama. Determined to die fighting rather than accept the humiliation of defeat. As the afternoon sun blazed across the Pacific on June 4th, 1942, Admiral Raymond Spruance faced the most critical decision of his naval career. The Hiryu remained afloat and operational, her location pinpointed by American reconnaissance aircraft. With the Yorktown crippled and dead in the water, Spruance commanded the only fully operational American carriers remaining in the Pacific. The weight of the entire war effort seemed to rest on his next order. At 0330 hours, Spruance launched 24 dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise. Determined to complete the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation begun that morning, Lieutenant Wilmer Earl Gallagher led the strike group through scattered clouds toward the Hiryu's last known position. Knowing that this attack would determine whether the American victory at Midway would be complete or merely partial, Admiral Yamaguchi, observing the approaching American aircraft from his bridge, made no attempt to flee. Instead, he ordered his remaining fighters airborne for one final defensive effort, then stood calmly beside his flagstaff as the American dive bombers began their attack runs. The Hiryu, like her sister ships before her, was caught with aircraft spotted on deck and fuel lines pressurized for launch operations. The American attack was swift and devastating. 4 direct hits transformed the pride of the Japanese 2nd Carrier Division into a floating torch within minutes. Fires spread rapidly through the ship's hangar and living spaces, trapping hundreds of sailors below decks. Yamaguchi, refusing all entreaties to abandon ship, went down with his flagship as she rolled over and sank just after 0200 hours on June 5th, taking with her the last remnants of the force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The destruction of all 4 Japanese carriers marked the end of organized resistance. But Admiral Yamamoto still commanded a powerful surface fleet, including battleships and heavy cruisers. For several hours, the Japanese commander-in-chief contemplated a night surface attack against the American fleet, hoping to salvage something from the disaster through superior gunnery and torpedo attacks. However, the loss of air cover made such an operation virtually suicidal, and Yamamoto reluctantly ordered a general withdrawal toward Japan. The aftermath of Midway revealed the true scope of the American victory. Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, over 250 aircraft, and more than 3,000 trained personnel, including many of her most experienced pilots. These losses, particularly in aircrew, would prove irreplaceable given Japan's limited training capacity and industrial base. The United States, by contrast, had lost 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel. Military historian John Keegan observed in The Price of Admiralty that Midway marked the moment when American industrial capacity and tactical flexibility overcame Japanese tactical superiority and strategic initiative, fundamentally altering the balance of power in the Pacific. The Yorktown, though abandoned, refused to die easily. Salvage teams reboarded the carrier on June 5th and managed to reduce her list and restore partial power. For a brief moment it seemed the wounded flat top might be saved. But Japanese submarine I-168 found her being towed toward Pearl Harbor. 2 torpedoes sent both the Yorktown and the destroyer Hamon to the bottom, providing the Japanese with their only consolation prize from the entire Midway operation. Admiral Nimitz, reviewing the battle reports at Pearl Harbor, recognized immediately that Midway represented far more than a tactical victory. The Japanese Navy's aura of invincibility had been shattered, and the initiative in the Pacific War had passed permanently to the United States. Within months, American forces would begin the long march across the Central Pacific that would ultimately lead to Tokyo Bay. The pilots and sailors who fought at Midway had achieved something that seemed impossible just days earlier. Outnumbered and flying inferior aircraft, they had defeated the most experienced naval air force in the world through courage, determination, and the priceless advantage of superior intelligence. The codebreakers of Station Hypo, the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, and the precision of the dive bombers had combined to create one of the most complete victories in naval history. As the sun set on June 6, 1942, painting the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson, the balance of power in the world's largest ocean had shifted irrevocably. The Japanese Empire would continue to fight for 3 more years, but it would never again possess the naval aviation strength that had made it master of the Pacific. Midway had proven that American industrial might, properly directed and courageously applied, could overcome any adversary. The tiny coral atoll that had been the focus of such desperate fighting returned to its peaceful obscurity, but its name would forever be associated with the moment when the tide of World War II turned decisively in favor of the Allied cause.